The first shot hit center mass. Right in the chest. A kill shot. And the bastard just laughed. Sergeant Decaret's mandibles twitched in disbelief. His squad had been running tactical incursions for years, cutting down resistance forces like a plasma blade through flesh. Humans weren't supposed to be different. They were supposed to die like everyone else. But this one... He just wiped a smear of blood from his lips and grinned. "Well, that was rude," the human said, rolling his shoulders like he'd just taken a hard hit in a sparring match instead of a plasma bolt to the chest. Decaret's squad shifted uneasily, their weapons still raised. This was a simple colony suppression mission, meant to secure Outpost Theta 7 for the Empire. Standard procedure: land, neutralize resistance, establish control. Except no one had mentioned anything about an unkillable human. "Again," Decaret barked. The squad obeyed. A volley of plasma fire erupted in a synchronized barrage, slamming into the human's chest and shoulders. The force should have been enough to liquefy his insides. Instead, he just took a step back, brushed some smoking debris off his ruined shirt, and let out a low whistle. "Damn. You guys really don't hold back, huh?" The squad hesitated. Their mandibles clicked in confusion. Plasma burns marred his uniform, but beneath it, his skin remained intact. No cauterized wounds, no visible damage beyond some minor singeing. This wasn't possible. Decaret snarled and switched his rifle to overload mode. If standard shots weren't enough, a concentrated blast at full charge would disintegrate him entirely. He fired. The explosion sent dust and smoke billowing across the battlefield. Rocks splintered. The ground cracked. The force of the blast left a smoldering crater where the human had stood. Decaret exhaled sharply. That had to be enough. Then the smoke cleared, and the human was still standing. "Oh, come on," he groaned, dusting off his arms. "Now you're just being excessive." Panic rippled through the squad. The formation broke. A few soldiers took involuntary steps backward, their training overridden by sheer disbelief. Then the human moved. Decaret barely saw it. 1 second he was standing there, and the next he was charging. It was unnatural. No hesitation. No fear. Just raw, reckless speed. He reached the first soldier before they could react. A single punch sent the trooper flying 10 meters through the air, armor crumpling like paper. Another swung a blade, aiming for the human's throat. The weapon connected, only for the blade to snap in half. The human sighed. "Really? You thought that was gonna work?" Decaret barely had time to process what was happening before the human turned toward him. "Your turn, big guy." A fist crashed into Decaret's chest like a battering ram. His vision blurred. He felt himself lift off the ground, flung backward like a ragdoll. The impact when he landed sent shockwaves of pain through his exoskeleton. The battlefield had changed. This wasn't a fight. This was a massacre. Pain. That was the first thing Decaret felt when he woke. A deep, throbbing pain that told him he was still alive. His arms were bound. Thick restraints pinned him to a steel chair in a dimly lit room. The metallic scent of blood filled the air. "Well, look who's awake." Decaret's mandibles twitched. That voice. The human stood in front of him, arms crossed, still wearing that maddening grin. He should have looked worse. Plasma burns marred his uniform, but his body? Unscathed. His skin wasn't seared. His limbs weren't mangled. "What are you?" Decaret rasped. The human shrugged. "Oh, just a guy." "Impossible." "Yeah, I get that a lot." Decaret forced himself to focus. He was a soldier. He had been trained for interrogation, for resistance, even in impossible situations. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. "You're wondering why I'm still standing," the human continued, pacing. "Why I didn't drop like your other enemies. Why your fancy rifles didn't turn me into space dust." Decaret remained silent. The human smirked. "Tell me, big guy, what do you know about humans?" "A test." Decaret chose his words carefully. "You're an aggressive species. Primitive. Overconfident. Weak." The human chuckled. "Weak, huh?" He gestured toward Decaret's restraints. "Then how do you explain this?" Decaret had no answer. See, here's the thing, the human continued, stepping closer. You're kind. You've got all these fancy tech advantages. Shields, plasma rifles, faster ships. You think that makes you better. But humans, we're different. His grin faded. We don't stop. A chill ran through Decare's exoskeleton. You can shoot us, burn us, break our bones. Hell, you can even kill some of us. The human's voice lowered, his eyes hardening. But as long as one of us is left standing, we keep coming. Decare's breathing slowed. He understood the implication. And for the first time in his military career, a sliver of fear wormed its way into his chest. And let me tell you, the human added, voice dropping to a near whisper, you made one hell of a mistake picking a fight with me. Decare clenched his jaw. He had to escape. He had to warn command. The human patted his shoulder mockingly. Don't worry, he said, stepping back. I'm not gonna kill you. Decare narrowed his eyes. Why not? The human smirked. Because I want you to tell them. Tell who? Your leaders. Your generals. Your empire. Decare remained silent. Tell them what happens when they mess with humans. The human turned toward the exit. The door hissed open, spilling harsh white light into the room. But before stepping through, he looked back one last time. And tell them, I'll be coming for them next. The door shut. And for the first time in his life, Sergeant Decare knew what true terror felt like. The first report came in from Outpost Theta 7. A squad had been wiped out. Not by orbital bombardment, not by overwhelming enemy forces. By one human. The transmissions were garbled, fragmented, panicked voices screaming about an unkillable enemy. Plasma rifles useless. Blades shattered on impact. A squad of veteran enforcers, the best Decare's empire had to offer, reduced to whimpering, desperate creatures begging for extraction. And then, silence. Fleet Commander Virac leaned back in his command chair, mandibles twitching. He had fought in more planetary campaigns than he cared to count. He had seen soldiers falter, break under pressure. But the fear he heard in those reports, that was different. Replay it, he ordered. The transmission crackled to life again, filling the command deck with the sound of chaos. He's still coming. We hit him with everything. He's ARJ. Another voice, strained and ragged. Fall back. Fall BA. Static. A third voice, barely a whisper, he's laughing. Then, nothing. Virac turned his cold, reptilian gaze to his intelligence officer. One human. The officer hesitated. It appears so, Commander. Impossible. We thought so, too. But Sergeant Decare's testimony confirms it. That name made Virac sit forward. Decare was no coward. He was a warrior, a battle-hardened veteran of the Empire's most brutal campaigns. If he had fled, then something was terribly wrong. The officer hesitated before continuing. He insists the human took multiple direct plasma hits and survived. That his strength is unnatural. Virac's mandibles clicked. He turned to his second-in-command. Where is this human now? The officer checked the fleet's orbital scans. Unknown. But if Decare is correct, a pause. He's coming. Virac narrowed his eyes. Then let him come. The human arrived faster than expected. Virac had stationed an entire battalion on Theta 7 after the reports came in. A force large enough to crush any resistance. But it didn't matter, because the human didn't come with an army. He was the army. The first attack hit the western perimeter. Motion sensors triggered, alarms blared, and sentries aimed their weapons into the darkness. Nothing. Then a scream. The sentries turned just in time to see a figure in the darkness, a blur of motion, a shadow given shape. The human tore through them like a force of nature, breaking bones, snapping weapons in half like twigs. One soldier managed to fire his plasma rifle point-blank. The human barely flinched. Then he grabbed the trooper by the throat and threw him through a reinforced bunker wall. By the time reinforcements arrived, all that remained were shattered bodies and a trail of destruction leading deeper into the base. Virac was waiting for him. The command center was fortified. reinforced blast doors, heavy turrets, dozens of elite guards armed with experimental plasma casters, weapons designed to disintegrate organic matter on impact. It wouldn't be enough. Virak stood at the center of the room, hands clasped behind his back, watching the monitors. The human was a blur of carnage. He moved like no biological entity should, too fast, too precise. Gunfire barely slowed him. Blades shattered on impact. At one point, the human caught a plasma grenade mid-air, examined it curiously, then threw it back with perfect accuracy. The resulting explosion annihilated an entire squad. Virak exhaled slowly. He had fought in dozens of wars, had watched planets burn. But for the first time in his long career, he wondered if he was looking at something beyond his understanding. Then, silence. The monitors flickered. The human was gone. The guards stiffened, weapons raised. Turrets scanned the room, automated targeting systems primed. A whisper of motion. Then, boom. The blast doors exploded inward. Smoke filled the air. Shapes moved within the haze. A guard fired wildly into the dust, then screamed as he was yanked into the fog. Another shout. Then a sickening crunch. Virak's hands tightened behind his back. Hold your ground. The smoke cleared. And there he was, standing amidst the wreckage, covered in blood, some his, most not. His uniform was in tatters, but his body remained whole, unbroken, eyes burning with something ancient, something unyielding. The human grinned. "Well," he said, cracking his knuckles, "you must be the boss." It took everything Virak had to remain still. The human was no mindless beast. He wasn't just destruction incarnate. He was aware, calculated. That made him even more dangerous. Virak gestured subtly, signaling his guards. "Kill him." The room erupted in gunfire. A dozen plasma bolts hit the human simultaneously, enough to melt a battleship's hull. The force slammed him backward, sending him crashing through a steel console. For a moment, there was silence. Then, laughter. Slow. Amused. The human got back up, cracked his neck, rolled his shoulders, then charged. The first guard barely had time to react before the human's fist caved in his skull. Another swung a combat blade, aiming for the throat. The human caught it mid-air, then drove it through the attacker's own chest. Virak moved for his personal weapon, a high-frequency disruptor capable of atomizing flesh, but the human was already there. A blur of motion, a flash of pain. Virak gasped as his arm bent the wrong way. The human pinned him against the command console, grinning through bloody teeth. "You know," he said conversationally, "you guys really don't learn." Virak wheezed, struggling. "What are you?" The human tilted his head. "I keep telling you." Another guard lunged. The human barely glanced in his direction. He caught the attacker by the wrist, twisted, and snap. The guard dropped. The human turned back to Virak. "You think your empire's unstoppable, that your fancy weapons make you better." He leaned in, voice low. "But humans, we don't stop." Virak's breath came in ragged gasps. "We fight when we're outnumbered. We fight when we're wounded. We fight when we should be dead." The human tightened his grip. "And you?" He smirked. "You just pissed off the wrong species." Virak's mind raced. His empire had conquered dozens of worlds, had crushed resistance after resistance. But for the first time, they had picked a fight they might not win. The human leaned in, whispering one final message. "Tell your empire." Then, darkness. The fleet was in full retreat. The empire did not retreat. It was an unshakable force, a juggernaut that swallowed entire civilizations and left nothing but silence in its wake. Their soldiers were the strongest, their weapons the deadliest, their ships the fastest. And yet, here they were, running, because of one human. Virak stood on the bridge of the warship Dominance, his arm still in a medical brace from where the human had shattered it. His mandibles clicked in frustration as he watched the chaos unfold on the holodisplays. Ships abandoned outposts mid-battle. Ground forces scrambled for extraction. No one knew where the human was, only that wherever he appeared, destruction followed. It wasn't just Theta 7 anymore. The reports had spread across multiple systems. Infiltrations, sabotage, entire regiments gone without a trace. A single human, bringing an empire to its knees. Virak exhaled slowly. No more underestimating. No more dismissing the impossible. The human wasn't just a soldier. He was a warrior god, something outside logic, outside reason. But even gods could be killed. Virak turned to his tactical officer. Deploy the executioners. A ripple of silence spread through the bridge crew. The executioners were the Empire's last resort. Elite assassins, genetically enhanced, surgically modified, trained in methods so brutal they were forbidden outside of total war. Their entire existence was a whispered secret, their methods spoken of only in hushed tones. The officer hesitated. Commander, you mean all of them? Virak's mandibles tightened. I mean all of them. If this human was death incarnate, then they would send their own. The executioners tracked the human to a derelict freighter drifting in the orbital debris field of a long-forgotten war. A ghost ship, abandoned and broken, its corridors thick with dust and silence. They boarded in silence, their weapons primed. Each of them had fought in over 100 battles. Each had survived encounters with horrors that shattered lesser warriors. But none of them felt at ease. Because they knew he was waiting. The first executioner died in the docking bay. The team entered through the main airlock, spreading out in a calculated formation. Every angle covered. Every sensor primed. Their visors scanned for movement. Nothing. Then a shadow flickered in the dim emergency lighting. A whisper of motion. Before the lead executioner could react, something hit him. Not a blade. Not a bullet. A fist. The impact launched him backward, smashing him through the bulkhead with enough force to dent reinforced steel. He crumpled. The others opened fire instantly. Plasma bolts streaked through the darkness, illuminating the corridor in bursts of violent light. The human's form flickered between the flashes, ducking, weaving, laughing. Then he was among them. A blade flashed. A gun twisted from its owner's hands and was turned against him. The sickening crunch of bone, the wet sound of bodies hitting the floor. It took 6 executioners to even slow him down. One managed to grab him from behind, locking his arms in an unbreakable hold. Another drove a combat blade toward his heart. The human twisted at the last moment. The blade meant for his heart slammed into his ribs, piercing flesh, but stopping just short of anything vital. He grinned through the pain. Nice try. Then he head-butted the executioner holding him, shattering the assassin's helmet with the sheer force of it. Blood and shards of reinforced polymer scattered across the deck. The remaining executioners hesitated. This wasn't possible. Even they felt pain. Even they slowed after taking a direct hit. But this human, he bled, but he did not stop. The last 2 assassins made a desperate move, detonating their own armor's fail-safe overload, unleashing a localized kinetic blast meant to turn everything within 10 meters into unrecognizable pulp. The freighter's hull buckled under the explosion. The dust settled. The executioners were gone. The human remained. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, then let out a low chuckle. Well, he muttered, flexing his blood-stained hands. That was fun. Virak received the report in stunned silence. His empire's greatest warriors. Gone. A cold realization settled in his chest. They were losing. Not just this battle. Not just a skirmish. The Empire was losing. To one man. He turned to his bridge crew, voice like steel. Prepare the judgment. Gasps rippled through the officers. Even the most battle-hardened among them stiffened. The judgment was not a weapon. It was annihilation. A planet killer. A weapon that devoured worlds in nuclear fire, forbidden under every war treaty across the galaxy. It was meant to be a last resort against entire civilizations. Now, it would be used against one human. A single target. An entire fleet would not do. Armies had failed. Assassins had failed. Now, they would simply erase everything. The fleet moved into position over the derelict freighter, the judgment charging its core. Energy readings spiked. Power coils hummed as they built toward an inevitable, inescapable death. There would be no escape, no survival. The human had nowhere to run. Virak exhaled slowly, watching from the bridge. This had to work. It had to. The countdown began. 10 seconds. On the main display, the freighter remained motionless in the void. No escape pods. No movement. 9 seconds. A strange sensation prickled at the edge of Virak's awareness. Something was wrong. 8 seconds. The sensors flared. A proximity warning. 7. The crew scrambled for answers. Something's approaching. 6. An object. Small. Fast. 5. Too fast. 4. It was coming from the freighter. 3. Virak's mandibles clicked in confusion, then understanding. 2. Not an escape pod. Not debris. A missile. 1. The explosion ripped through the fleet like a god's wrath. Virak's world turned to fire. Silence. For the first time in his life, Fleet Commander Virak knew true silence. Not the kind that came with deep space. Not the eerie stillness of a battlefield after the last shot was fired. This was the silence of obliteration. The bridge of the Dominance was in chaos. Fire and smoke filled the command deck. Officers scrambled to contain the damage, their voices frantic, their movements desperate. The fleet was in ruins. Half of their warships had been reduced to drifting wreckage. The Judgment, their planet killer, the ultimate weapon of the Empire, was gone, destroyed by a single, well-placed missile before it could fire. And the worst part, the human was still alive. Virak coughed, tasting blood, his vision swimming as he tried to process the impossible. How had a single man done this? How had he known? The answer came through the smoke, stepping onto the bridge like death itself. The human, bruised, bleeding, but grinning. Man, he said, stretching his arms, I was really hoping you'd go for the doomsday weapon. You guys just love those, huh? Virak tried to move. His body refused. His broken arm hung limp at his side, shattered ribs making every breath a struggle. His surviving officers raised their weapons, but their hands were unsteady. They knew. Their guns didn't matter. Nothing did. The human tilted his head, studying them with something almost like amusement. I'll give you credit, he said. You tried. Most people don't make it this far. Virak's mandibles twitched. You are not a man. The human smirked. Jury's still out on that one. What are you? Virak whispered. The human stepped closer, crouching in front of the beaten commander. For the first time, the grin faded, replaced by something deeper. Older. I'm human. His voice was quiet. And humans, we don't stop. Virak shuddered. He had spent his entire life believing his empire was unstoppable, that they were the ultimate power in the galaxy, that nothing could challenge them. But now he realized the truth. They had never encountered real war. Not like this. Not like him. Virak exhaled sharply, forcing himself to ask the question burning in his mind. What happens now? The human stood, rolling his shoulders. That depends. He gestured to the wreckage surrounding them. You can keep this going if you want. Keep throwing fleets at me. Keep sending assassins. See how far that gets you. Virak swallowed hard. You could go home, the human continued. Tell your people. Tell your empire. Tell them what? The human smile returned, sharp as a blade. Tell them Earth is off limits. Virak hesitated. This was mercy, a chance to end it, a chance to survive. He looked at his officers. Their fear was palpable. Their hands trembled. The Empire had lost. They all knew it. Slowly, painfully, Virak nodded. The human clapped him on the shoulder, making him wince. See, that wasn't so hard. He turned, stepping toward the shattered remains of the bridge doors. Virak forced himself to speak. Will I see you again? The human paused. Then, without looking back, he said, Only if you're stupid enough to try this again. Then he was gone. The Empire never returned to Earth. Rumors spread. Stories whispered in darkened war rooms, in hushed voices across conquered worlds. Tales of a single human, unkillable, unstoppable. Some believed he was a myth, a ghost. But those who had seen him, those who had survived, knew the truth. They had shot a human. And he just laughed, and kept on coming.